The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 20, Segment 6, Rewards, Part 2.
Thanks for tuning back in, and we're going to pick up just where we left off right now. We cannot look at rewards without looking at FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. He stayed in power by acquiring damaging evidence on Washington politicians, and they knew he had the evidence, so they were scared to do anything against him. And even though there were allegations about his sexuality and his private interests, such as gambling and collecting various types of pornography, J. Edgar Hoover stayed in power, and as a result of his involvement in the Kennedy assassination, with he and his FBI team writing the first report and handing it to his friend and former neighbor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover got some rewards. The rewards he wanted. And those are only two rewards. One, LBJ, as the new president, allowed J. Edgar Hoover to stay in his job and not force him to mandatorily retire under a law that existed at the time, where all federal government employees had to retire at the age of 70. Johnson waived that for his friend and allowed Hoover to stay in power as the FBI director up until his death in 1972, dying at the age of 77. The other gift or reward that Hoover got was a new federal building. Although it had been in the works, money had not been set aside for it. But during Johnson's term, a new federal building for the FBI was starting to be constructed, and when it was finished, it bore the name J. Edgar Hoover FBI Building. Hoover wanted nothing more than that. We've discussed on occasions in the past Fred Korth, the lawyer from Texas. He improperly directed federal contracts to various airplane and helicopter manufacturers. Of course, the most significant, the TFX, involved approximately $6.5 billion in money that Korth slid to General Dynamics, a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy, a company that was not supposed to get the contract because they were the least qualified and had the highest bid. By him pushing the TFX contract to General Dynamics, not only did he save that company, but he actually saved the bank where he used to be president, the Continental National Bank of Fort Worth, which, if he had not pulled that contract and gotten it to General Dynamics, that bank itself would have gone under because it made almost $400 million in loans to General Dynamics. And if General Dynamics would have gone under, so would that bank. Fred Korth, after all of the involvement and brunt of the scandal, ended up a wealthy man with a gentrified lifestyle. I guess you really cannot spell Kennedy assassination rewards without the name Foris, Abe Foris, an Ivy League lawyer housed in Washington, D.C., a person who counseled Lyndon Johnson, going all the way back to the 1940s, a man that was known nationally among lawyers as a person with no morals and no conscience. That Abe Foris received huge rewards for his help and counsel to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Most probably, he was the one that thought of first the Texas Commission and then the Warren Commission, which Johnson ultimately created as an investigative body to look into the Kennedy assassination. Foris rewards didn't necessarily involve money, but ego and power. And that came from being recognized as someone. And Johnson did that with Abe Foris by first appointing him to the United States Supreme Court. Foris became a known figure internationally as a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And of course, he was on the verge for moving up and becoming the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, all happening during Lyndon Johnson's reign. There was only one problem, and that was Abe Foris was dirty, and the dirt finally surfaced. As a result, Abe Foris, in the face of impeachment as United States Supreme Court Justice, resigned in disgrace. If one chooses to believe the claims that the mob, the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, was behind putting the Kennedy-Johnson ticket together and wanted Johnson on the ticket as a backup in case there were problems or an illness or death with John Kennedy. If one chooses to believe that the Kennedy family, John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, were not keeping their word by prosecuting mob members, by going after mob members, and by actually trying to knock off the backup man from his designated position, and that was Lyndon Johnson as the vice president, by creating and having scandals go against Johnson, then it would seem likely to believe that three mobsters, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Sam Giancana, may have been involved in the killing of John F. Kennedy. And if we look at each one of these individuals after Johnson took power, for the most part, none of these men had any problems. Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans, the crime boss, while he was in the midst of a criminal trial for fraud at the exact time that Kennedy was killed, nothing happened to him. And in 1966, he and 13 other people were charged with criminal conspiracy. At that time, all charges against him were dropped. And during that same time period, Santo Trafficante out of Tampa had no criminal problems, aside from one arrest and a charge in the 1950s, which was dropped, and a conviction in 1954 that was overturned. Santo Trafficante, during this entire period of time, was untouchable. And all during that time, Trafficante, along with several other mob families, were involved in a drug trafficking network. The last person out of the group that supposedly was involved with having John F. Kennedy killed was a man by the name of Sam Giancana out of Chicago, Illinois. And at least from 1957 to about 1966, he was known as the head of the Chicago crime family, the outfit. And nothing happened to him during that period of time, except in 1965, he was convicted of contempt in court because he refused to talk to a grand jury, and he remained silent in spite of being granted immunity. And if we broaden our horizon even further and we look beyond these three men, but we look at the actual criminal organization in the United States during the Johnson term, Johnson's efforts were to undermine all federal efforts to go after organized crime members during his presidency. Perhaps Johnson realized that Kennedy was killed because of his family's failure to honor its commitment to organized crime, or perhaps Johnson was involved with such members on the killing of Kennedy, and what he did thereafter as president was a reward for their efforts to allow him to step up and to become president. According to William Romer, one of the FBI's top Chicago agents and an organized crime authority, Lyndon Baines Johnson did more to harm the federal government's ability to fight organized crime than any other president in American history. Up on the green screen are several graphs showing the actual reduction in Justice Department time spent attempting to go after organized crime members once Lyndon Johnson took office. In 1966, the Attorney General who replaced Robert F. Kennedy when he resigned, Nicholas Kastenbach, ruled that more than 900 pages of wiretap conversations between people involved in the organized crime could not be used as evidence in cases. This, of course, bootstrapped all attempts to go after organized crime. As long as we're discussing rewards, I have a reward for you, and that is we're going to end this segment now, and we're going to pick up creating another segment in 2 seconds. See you then.